For 19 years, every mirror and every whisper told Clara she was worthless. So when her father finally traded her to the Apache Chief Taza, she felt nothing. She was a broken toy being discarded. But as she followed the silent chief into the vast, unforgiving desert, a strange feeling began to stir. It wasn't fear. It was the terrifying, unbelievable flicker of hope. This is the story of a girl given away, who had to lose everything to finally find herself. She shed no tears when her father finalized the trade. Not from any well of courage, but because the basin of her sorrow had long run dry, leaving only the arid dust of disgrace. She stood there, a silent shadow in the flickering firelight, her homespun dress hanging loose on a frame that had known more labor than nourishment. Her tangled hair hid a face marked by a feature her stepmother had always called unfortunate. The two men spoke of her, but not to her. They bartered over her as if she were merchandise, a head of livestock. "She's strong," her father said, his voice flat and emotionless, "and I have 5 other mouths to feed." The Chief Taza, a man built as broad and silent as a mesa, merely inclined his head in response. He tossed a stack of cured hides and a few pieces of ironwork onto the ground, and the exchange was complete. Clara understood perfectly. This was not an abduction. It was a disposal. One does not abduct a broken thing. One simply gives it away. That feeling of rejection was a brand seared deep into a girl's soul. She had prepared herself for blows. FOR shouted commands to force her into obedience. But Taza did nothing of the sort. He simply handed her a thick wool blanket, a gesture that was silent but absolute. He nodded his head toward his horse, and she understood. On the trail, he rode ahead, his back straight, never once looking back. Clara stumbled along behind him, her mind numb, reeling with memories of her father's disgusted gaze, of the townsfolk's whispers that no man would ever want her. Yet with every mile deeper into the desert, a strange feeling stirred within her. It was not fear, nor was it hope. It was a sharp awareness that she had finally left behind everyone who had ever told her she was not worth loving. As the sun set, they stopped in a quiet clearing by a stream. Taza dismounted and looked at her. His gaze did not look through her, or past her as if she were air. It settled squarely upon her. The stillness in that look unnerved her more than any slap would have. Clara stood frozen, clutching the blanket. "Why don't you say anything?" she whispered. He did not answer. Instead, he knelt and began to build a fire between them. Not a fire of intimidation or control, but a fire to keep her warm. And then, a tiny forgotten ember deep within her chest, something long cold and coiled, flickered faintly back to life. Sleep had been a stranger for years, but here it had found her. Clara awoke not to a command, but to the scent of corn roasting over embers and the sound of water trickling over stones. He was already awake, kneeling by the stream, washing a strip of meat with slow, practiced movements. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the clearing. A simple nod of his head, a greeting, not an order. It was such a simple thing. That quiet acknowledgement, yet it sent a confusing warmth through her, followed by the familiar sting of shame. Why should a common courtesy feel like a precious gift? At home, even her younger brothers mimicked their father's sneer, calling her crowface whenever their stepmother wasn't listening. And here, this man whom her people called a savage had not once raised his voice. In the following days, they traveled deeper into the hills. Their communication was nearly wordless, made of gestures and glances, but his silence held no cruelty, only patience. Once, while crossing a rushing stream, her worn boots slipped on a slick stone. A strong hand grasped her arm, steadying her before she could fall. The grip was firm, yet held no harshness. The foreign sensation of a touch meant only to help, not to harm, brought a sudden sharp ache to her throat. She fought back a sob, not of pain, but of a strange and sorrowful gratitude. That night, he handed her a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs. He motioned for her to place it under her sleeping mat, and when he saw her confusion, he whispered in broken English, "Dream good." That small kindness, so simple and direct, shattered something inside her. For the first time since her mother died, Clara allowed herself to cry. Not tears of rejection, but of the realization that this man, who owed her nothing, treated her as a living soul of value. In the weeks that followed, her legs grew steadier. She no longer trailed behind Taza, she walked beside him. Sometimes, she could smell the scent of pine smoke in his braids. Sometimes she watched how confidently he moved through a land that seemed to breathe with him. He began to point out herbs to her, to name the animals in his deep, measured voice, but one afternoon their peace was disturbed. A young, arrogant Apache man rode past. He said something to Taza in a mocking tone, his eyes flicking to her with a smirk that held a question needing no translation. Taza didn't flinch, but Clara saw his jaw tighten. That evening, as the fire crackled between them, the silence felt heavy. Finally she gathered her courage, her voice a near whisper. "That man, does he think I am your punishment?" Taza watched the fire for a long moment. He did not answer her question. Instead, he reached into a leather pouch and drew out an object of dark polished wood. He placed it in her hand. It was a comb, its curve fitting the cup of her palm as if it were made for it. "My mother," he said, his voice slow. "Made for wife," but she did not return. Clara was stunned. Her throat tightened as something old and bitter inside. Her broke open. "You could have refused me," she breathed, her eyes fixed on the comb. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes holding a truth that stripped away all her defenses. "Your eyes held great sorrow," he said simply. "I do not turn away from sorrow." Later that night, by the fire's glow, she drew the smooth wooden teeth through her tangled hair. Each stroke seemed to loosen a knot not just in the strands, but in her soul. For the first time, a new thought took root. Perhaps her face was never the reason she had been left behind. Perhaps the real reason was that, until now, no one had ever truly bothered to see her. The first time Clara laughed, the sound surprised them both. She had tripped on a gnarled root while gathering firewood, landing an undignified heap of pine needles. When she looked up, ready for the familiar sting of ridicule, she saw Taza. Turning away, one hand covering his mouth, but his strong shoulders were shaking with a suppressed, crooked grin. The sheer absurdity of the situation, a bartered girl with twigs in her hair, being watched by a silent chief, burst from her. A sharp, clear peal of laughter that echoed through the trees. After a moment of stunned silence, he laughed too. It was not a loud or long sound, but it was real. And in that shared moment, something between them shifted again, settling into a new, more comfortable shape. In the days that followed, the silence between them became companionable. Clara began to mimic his hand signs for water, fire, and food, feeling a small pride with each new thing she learned. One evening, as she helped him skin a rabbit, he watched her hands and said, "You are not weak." It was not a compliment, in the usual way, but it struck her more deeply than any flattery ever had. But peace, she was learning, is a fragile thing. It shattered the next day when they reached a small Apache village nestled in a canyon. The women stared, some whispering behind their shawls. An elder, his face a roadmap of harsh lines, approached Taza, his words clipped and sharp. Clara stood back, uncertain, but she understood enough to know his disapproval was directed at her. Then the elder's arm shot out, pointing directly at Clara, and he spat on the dry earth at her feet. The insult needed no translation. Her body reacted before her mind could, cringing inward out of a lifetime's habit of scorn. She expected Taza's usual stoicism. Instead, he took a step forward, his jaw clenched. He spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight of authority that made even the elder step back. Clara did not understand the words, but their effect was clear. Taza had claimed her, not as a burden, but as someone worthy of defending. That night, as they camped on the edge of the village, Clara sat by the fire and whispered, "Why do you keep doing that? Standing up for me?" He said nothing for a long time, only prodding the fire with a stick. Finally, when she thought he would not answer, he murmured, his gaze still fixed on the dancing flames. "Because no one stood for my sister either, and she broke." In that moment, Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she felt she truly saw him, the man, not just the chief. She understood that they were both remnants, things discarded by others, but here, in the wilderness, their broken edges were beginning to fit together. They left the village at dawn. The tension still clung to Clara like the smoke from last night's fire, but something had shifted. She no longer felt like a shadow trailing behind. She felt like a partner. She carried her own supplies, knew how to set small traps, and could even recognize the call of a red-tailed hawk overhead. And Taza, though still sparing with words, had begun to look at her in a way that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a hope so unfamiliar it felt dangerous to Matt. Yet that fragile thread was tested when they stumbled upon a settler's attacked wagon at the base of a ridge. The wheels were splintered. One horse lay dead, the other trembled, its coat matted with fear. Clara froze at the sight of a woman, blonde, pale, and bruised, clutching a bloody rifle and whispering prayers. Taza approached cautiously, but the woman shrieked at the sight of him. She raised the rifle with shaking hands, screaming, "Don't touch me, savage!" Before collapsing into sobs, Clara stepped forward, her hands raised, her voice as soft as she could make it. "He's not going to hurt you, I promise." But the woman's blue eyes locked on her with confusion and betrayal. "You're with him?" She spat, as if Clara herself were the traitor. They helped her anyway. Taza tended to her wounds while Clara coaxed the terrified horse into calmness. By nightfall, the woman, whose name was Ruth, had stopped flinching at every movement, though her eyes still flicked to Taza with suspicion. That night, Clara sat apart, her heart churning with a shame she hadn't felt since leaving her father's house. A voice inside whispered that no matter how kind Taza was, to people like Ruth, he would always be a monster. And by standing at his side, she would be seen as monstrous too. Finally, when she dared to ask Taza why he hadn't just left Ruth to die, he did not look at her. He just said, his voice low, and even because she was alone, "You have not forgotten what it is to be alone." And Clara remembered. She remembered all too well. But for the first time, she understood that to walk beside a man like Taza meant choosing to live by a different kind of honor. Not the kind written in books or shouted in town squares, but the quiet kind, the kind that only reveals itself when no one else is watching. The dawn brought a chill air and poisoned whispers. Clara heard Ruth's voice, strained and fearful. "They aren't like us, you don't understand. They kill people." "He saved your life." Clara's voice cut in, firm despite the tremble beneath it. She stepped out from behind the rocks. Ruth flinched. "You weren't raised out here," she hissed. "You don't know what they've done." 1,000 memories of mockery and scorn flashed through Clara's mind. "No," she said, her voice quiet but heavy. "I know exactly what people do when they decide someone is beneath them." By midday, they reached the hill Ruth had described. Below, the cavalry outpost lay like a scar of raw timber and canvas. On the prairie, a place that, as a girl, Clara would have dreamed of as a sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage. Ruth was greeted immediately. Soldiers rushed out, but their eyes swept past Clara and settled, cold and hostile, on Taza. "Step back. Savage!" One of them barked. When Clara opened her mouth to speak, another soldier grabbed her arm. "We'll get you home, miss." "Don't you worry, we'll handle him." They bound Taza's hands. He did not resist, did not speak a word, even as they dragged him away. "Stop it, he's with me," Clara shouted, but no one listened. The world that had always ignored her had finally noticed her, but only to put her back in the box she had spent her life escaping. As they hauled Taza away, his eyes found hers. There was no fear in them, no anger, only an unbroken stillness, a silent strength that had been with her since the first night. And in that look, Clara knew that if she did not fight for him now, she would be no better than the father who sold her. She stormed into the captain's tent, fire in her heart. "On what charge is he being held?" The officer, a man with whiskey on his breath, looked up slowly. "Because he's an Apache, miss. In this territory, that's charge enough." The words stole the air from her lungs. She found Ruth by a fire, bandaged and clean. "Say something," Clara begged. But Ruth looked away, muttering, "It's better this way. You'll be safe now." Clara stared at her, stunned. "You were never the one in danger," she whispered. That night, she found Taza kneeling in the holding tent, his hands tied, bruises starting to bloom on his jaw. She dropped to her knees beside him, her voice choked. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought you here." He shook his head slowly, murmuring, "You needed to see." And she did see. She saw that the world she had once yearned for only wanted to cage her again. She pressed her forehead against his, tears finally falling, hot and real. She had made her choice. "I will not let them hold you," she whispered. And she felt, more than heard, the long, slow exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for far too long, waiting. Clara waited. She waited until the outpost grew still, until the men were drunk on their own righteousness, and the guard near the tent dozed with his rifle slack in his arms. Then she moved like someone with nothing left to lose. Her heart pounded as she crept through the shadows to the storage shed. Inside, she found a rusty hatchet, a coil of rope, and a pair of bolt cutters. As she slipped them beneath her shawl, she did not feel like a rescued girl or a fugitive's accomplice. For the first time, she felt entirely like herself. She slipped into the tent and knelt beside Taza. He did not speak, only watched her with those still, knowing eyes. As she snapped the chains from his wrists, he whispered, "If we run, they will follow." But she shook her head, her voice firm. "Then let them follow. We will show them what strength really looks like." They moved fast, keeping to the tree line. Her smaller frame darted ahead while Taza, despite his bruises, kept pace, guiding them east toward a canyon he said the cavalry would not dare enter. By dawn, they reached the ravine. Clara collapsed to her knees, breath ragged. "They will call me a traitor," she murmured. Taza knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her dirt-streaked face. "No," he said. "Only those who fear the truth use that word." They traveled for 3 more days. When they arrived at a hidden clearing, an old woman with a kind face sat tending a fire. "My aunt," Taza explained. The woman looked at Clara without surprise, as if she had been expecting her. But their peace did not last. 2 weeks later, the search party found their tracks. Clara spotted them from a ridge. 5 riders, rifles gleaming, and Ruth among them. "They found us," she gasped as she ran back. Taza stood, not with panic, but with a tired readiness. "Go into the ravine," he told Clara. "You and my aunt must hide." But she grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce. "I am not leaving you. If they take you again, they will have to shoot me first." He looked at her, pain etched deep in his eyes. "You should not die for me." "Then you never understood," she answered. "I am not dying for you. I am living for what you taught me." The confrontation happened as the sun struck the clearing. The captain raised his rifle. Ruth called out weakly, "Let the girl go. We can still help her." But Clara stepped forward first, her voice loud and clear. He is not your prisoner. He is my husband." The words hung in the air. Though they had never spoken vows, the claim was a truth as raw and sacred as anything carved in stone. The soldiers hesitated. Taza stepped beside her, his shoulders straight, his presence a mountain behind her resolve. "You do not get to decide who I belong to," Clara said, her voice breaking but firm. "Not you, not my father, not this uniform. You gave me away because I was ugly, and he gave me back my life because he saw more than a face." Silence followed. Then a young soldier in the back muttered, "Let them be, sir. They ain't hurting anyone." Ruth looked down, ashamed. The captain, furious but cornered, finally spat on the ground and barked, "This isn't over, then," turned his horse and rode away. Clara did not move until the dust settled. Then she slowly turned to Taza, her hand reaching for his. In that moment, they were no longer fugitives or outcasts. They were two souls who had stood the world down and won. The seasons turned in the hidden canyon, and with each sunrise, Clara shed another piece of the girl she once was, the girl who flinched at mirrors, who swallowed her words, who thought love was something earned by pleasing cruel men. Under the quiet guidance of Taza and the gentle wisdom of his aunt, she learned the language of the earth. She learned to heal with herbs, to weave nets, to track elk. She learned not because she needed to survive, but because she wanted to belong. And belonging here, she discovered, was not about changing who you were, but finally recognizing what had been there all along. She and Taza never spoke of marriage again. But they planted corn together, shared stories beside the fire, and when Clara touched his face, it was with a reverence that needed no ceremony to sanctify it. One afternoon, she caught her own image in the clear water of the stream. A face browned by the sun, hands calloused from work, hair wild with the wind. For the first time she did not flinch. She saw strength. She saw defiance. She saw a kind of beauty that no polished mirror in any town could ever reflect. Travelers came now and then, and word of their stand against the cavalry spread in whispers, not as scandal, but as legend. Some called her mad, others brave, but Clara did not care. She had not chosen Taza to prove anything to the world, only to herself. Word eventually came that her father had died alone and bitter. She felt no triumph, only a quiet unburdening, like the final sigh after a long illness. She went down to the stream and planted wildflowers along the bank, not in his memory, but in honor of the girl he had tried and failed to break. As she watched the petals dance in the breeze, Taza came from behind, wrapping her in the same thick wool blanket he had offered her on that first terrifying night. The circle was complete. "No one," he whispered into her hair, his voice a low, steady promise, "will ever give you away again." She closed her eyes and leaned into his strength, a smile touching her lips. Not because every wound had vanished, but because the parts of her that mattered had grown back stronger, rooted in a love that was finally and completely hers. The canyon walls held the last of the autumn sun, casting long shadows that painted the valley in hues of gold and deep purple. 20 seasons had turned to 20 more. The world outside had changed in ways they only heard about from the rare traveler. But here, time moved like the stream, steady and peaceful. Clara sat at the entrance of their dwelling, a home built of stone, timber, and patience. The hands that rested in her lap were no longer a girl's hands, but those of a woman who knew the earth. They were wrinkled and marked by time, but they were strong. Her gaze was soft, watching the small girl with hair as dark as Taza's playing. By the water's edge, the girl was humming, trying to pull a simple wooden comb through the knotted yarn hair of a cornhusk doll. On the ledge inside, safe from small hands, rested another comb. Dark polished wood, worn smooth by a lifetime of reverent use. Clara's comb, a quiet footstep announced his presence. Taza sat beside her, moving with the careful grace of an old man whose strength had settled deep into his bones. He said nothing, simply followed her gaze. The evening air grew cool, and he reached for a thick, woven blanket, one she had made years ago, and draped it over both their shoulders. Watched as their granddaughter finally untangled the doll's hair and held it up with a triumphant smile. Clara leaned her head against Taza's shoulder, the rough wool of the blanket a familiar comfort. He had given her many gifts over a lifetime, a home, a family, a quiet love as constant as the stream. But the greatest gift, she knew, was the simplest dot he had taught her how to see. Not just the world around her, but the woman reflected in the water, and to find her beautiful,